What's going on, guys? It's Morgan here, and welcome back to predictions. And we're going to be going over the results from week 1 of the June Joust today, and then there'll be another video later on in the week going through next week's scores, going for our predictions, and breaking down the teams that we haven't actually broken down yet. So there are going to be some interesting teams going into this next week that we're going to get to talk about. But for this video, we both get to show you how badly or how well we both predicted these games, and it was a weekend for upsets, wasn't it, Joe?
Oh yeah. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. You said how poorly or how well we predicted. We just predicted poorly. It's that simple.
I I'll just grab it. Going into I think the first day, I got 5 points. Not bad. I dropped 1 point. I didn't pick up a single point until the very last game of the weekend in terms of the West region, and then I got one right prediction in terms of the East region. It's just
Yeah. I mean, I'm in the exact same boat you are. I mean, I dropped a like I think 1 point each game. So 2 points on Friday. Didn't pick up a single point the next day, and then only got 4 points out of 6 on the last day for the West. And then I didn't pick up a point besides 2 in the East, like, at all.
in terms of going for the Pickems reward, we're not doing very well. But in terms of our personal rankings, you're currently beating me by 2 points or 1 point, I
Yeah.
think. Uh,
Uh, I think I'm at 10.
yeah, you're beating me by 1 point, and I was winning until until I was too loyal. I could have won this weekend
Yeah.
if I wasn't loyal.
Yep.
Uh, anyway, we're gonna go through the scores and talk about them now. Enough of us ranting, but the first game, Paris Eternal and Toronto Defiant, I got this game right. I think I got this game perfectly correct, 3-1. I don't think anybody was really expecting Paris to win this game. There was like the outside chance they were gonna win it, but it was just it was it was a very outside chance considering how poorly they did in the melee.
Right, but again, I mean, you can't really take the melee into too heavy consideration because you have to remember that a lot of these teams have had a couple of weeks off after not qualifying, and add to that the fact that on paper, Paris isn't an awful team. They should be improving at some point here. I guess that Toronto wasn't exactly that statement that they needed.
No. but Toronto, they got the win, but it wasn't really the best weekend for them. We'll get onto that in a little bit, but I both of these teams are still, I think, searching for that spark to get their season properly going. I mean, obviously Toronto won this weekend, but then they had another poor result in the rest of the weekend, and it's finding the consistency to be able to win. If you're playing 2 games in the week and be able to win both of your games, then because there's like 16 games this entire season, and each of those games that matter now. They're not long seasons anymore. So each loss matters way more than it has in any other season. And if you're taking like a quarter of the season at this point to get it going, it's gonna be tough to get into the grand finals.
Right. Especially if you're consistently not qualifying because you can do well, but if you are consistently falling just short of qualifying, like Paris did in May Melee and like it looks like they might here
June Joust.
in June Joust, I mean you can mark it up as a good season and it's a good rebuilding season, but that's not what you want to see.
Not at all. Um, Moving over to our second game, which I think this is something we also coming. Maybe we didn't give for this game specifically. We didn't give London as much credit as maybe we should have done. Obviously, like you said, they've had this more time because Florida went to the Melee, London didn't. They've had this time to think about their losses and properly regroup. And I think the coach firing that actually happened kind of had a positive impact on the team. You've obviously got some of their DPS players, which are probably the stars of their team. Not probably, they are. And you got to see them on the characters that they're comfortable with this weekend, and I think Blase specifically was their highlight player this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, giving giving their DPS a chance to actually play their characters and not try to force them into a meta has really, I think, exploded um, London into a team that can be threatening. And I mean, we saw it against Florida. They took the first map. I think that kind of sparked something in them. Even though, as we get later into this weekend, we'll see that it also wasn't a very good weekend for London either. But I think they're starting to improve heavily, and maybe because I remember we talked about it that maybe the Rhine ban would affect London a little bit. I think actually the different meta has helped them a lot because they get to experiment with different tanks and having their main tank play something a little different.
Yeah, I would say it has helped them, but also they seem to get stuck in one team composition. That seems to be their issue at the moment. I mean, we'll get onto it in the later game, but it worked in this game. Florida didn't seem to at first be able to adapt to they were playing classic dive throughout the entire weekend. I don't think Florida adapted to it as wasn't really expecting it right away. But obviously they came then bounced back, and Florida are potentially one of the best teams in NA at the moment, and they were expected to win this, and they did. They're just an all-rounded team. Like we sometimes we pick out specific parts of their roster, but like this is just a really well-rounded team in general.
Exactly. I mean, they have everything that they need to make another push towards June Joust. And I mean, I'm looking at it right now because I just went into the map details for this match, but even we're saying we're not giving London credit. London kept it close for most of this match. I mean, the only really blowout win by Florida was 2-0 on Ilios. Everything else was 1 point off and into overtime.
Oh yeah. I mean, this is so much. It's definitely an improvement by a long shot for London. I mean, they went into, especially with Lumbani. That was an amazing attack. After possibly they could have lost it. They could have lost it very easily at the end on a Lumbani attack when they held Florida to only 4 points. And to be able to do that and to be able to take a map from the team that made it to I think they made it to the losers semifinals of Melee. It's impressive, and the fact that they only just lost for Sky in overtime, as you said. So it's by no means was it a blowout win, and by no means does the scoreline really reflect how both teams really played. Because, like you said, only win that they really dominated in was Ilios, and even then, it was still. Yeah, granted, the first point was very rough for London. They still brought it back, and they still had good percentages on the board for the second round. So it's just finding the form for London at this point, and with their schedule, it's going to be very hard. Obviously, their second game they had this weekend was the game that everybody was looking at for them to pick up that first win, and yeah, it didn't really happen. But
Right.
we're gonna move into the APAC region now. The first games in there, we actually had the Guangzhou Chargers losing 3-1 to the Hangzhou Spark, which was actually a result that a lot of us saw coming. The Guangzhou Charge not exactly had the best start, but again, it doesn't matter as much. And as we went on to see later on in the weekend, it didn't matter as much. But Hangzhou Spark definitely turning around their season at the moment, taking 3-2 on Eichenwald, they won 3-1 on Dorado, and then 4-3 on Temple of Anubis. But same with the London Spitfire. This wasn't really it wasn't a blowout win for Hangzhou. They were contesting the point. The only really big win they had was on Dorado. In fact, they didn't take a single point on Lijiang Tower in the first map.
Right. But I mean, like you said, and like I think a lot of people were saying, this was this Sparks game to lose. I mean, the Charge definitely are the bottom feeder of APAC right now from what we've been seeing, though they could turn it around. But I think the Spark have such a scrappy team, and even though it was close, I, I think the Spark are gonna have to fight for every win they get this season.
Oh yeah, by a long way. I mean, even watching it, the casters, it was a caster's nightmare to cast this game because there was no fluid gameplay. It was all rolls for every single team fight. There was no fluidity at all, and you'd expect them from Hungry Spark specifically with their team in general, them to be playing more fluid Overwatch. I mean, you expect it from the charge. Being one of the bottom teams, you expect them to have more scrappy engagements, maybe clawing their way to taking points or taking maps, which they did. But it was their DPS line there for the Hungry Spark were just not, maybe not performing as well as they could be, or I don't know. It was just not very clean Overwatch to watch.
And hey, I mean, I guess you got to do what you got to do sometimes to get those wins when they count and when they matter.
Yeah. So we're gonna go on to the second game of APAC now. We're going to a game which we hyped this up as being one of the premier games to watch this weekend. And like we said in the video that it might happen, it did happen, and it was a 3-0 for the Shanghai Dragons actually, which was I don't know if you could mark this up as a surprise after how well the Shanghai Dragons have been not only this season but throughout the entirety of last season as well. They've been one of the informed teams, and with their team that they have, it's they're just a really impressive team to watch. They're by far one of the best teams in the APAC region. I mean, it seems, if you even look at the map summary, it seems like it took a long time for the Chengdu Hunters to wake up. They didn't properly wake up until the last map, and then granted, they did take it to the Shanghai Dragons. It was a 6-5 game on Junkertown, but they still couldn't bring it together and force into the fourth map.
Right. And I mean, when you look at it, these are and we'll talk about it a little later too, because again, two top teams in APAC went at it later on this weekend. But these are the premier teams in APAC, even though now Chengdu's record might not show it, and Shanghai shows it more. Even though they didn't really wake up until Junkertown, it was still a 2-1 on Hollywood. That neither team made it to final point on Hollywood. And the only real, again, blowout win was map 1 on Oasis when Shanghai 2-0'd them. These teams are good and they put up a fight when they go up against each other.
Oh yeah, and even though again, even though it was a 3-0, we didn't. It was still a very good game to watch, especially from the second map on Hollywood. I mean, Hollywood is notoriously known as the map where you don't finish that last point is so hard to push on when you're the attacking team. And as you can see, Chengdu only just captured the hybrid point, and Shanghai couldn't even finish the map. So it's going to be interesting, especially this is the first season where we're actually playing Hollywood with the addition of the elevators. So maybe that will play more of a difference. It didn't really play much of a factor in this game, but there is a lot of strategies that you can be using, and you get a lot of height advantage with that, especially with how close, like how populated the second point is going into actually push it indoors. You've got a lot of room to work with, a lot of sniper lines of sight to get off, and with these two teams, they have the hit scan players to play to get it done, and they did.
Exactly.
So moving on, we're going into a shock, actually, a very big shock. Maybe not a shock. If you look at this team's previous records and what they've done in previous years, but for this season specifically, New York Excelsior picking up the win over Philadelphia Fusion is actually a shock victory. And it wasn't just a fluke win. They dominated the Fusion. The only map that the Fusion took and actually did well on and got points was Rialto.
Yeah, I mean, I think this was a long time coming for New York, honestly. I don't think New York is as bad as people say they were during May Melee, and maybe that's because I wasn't really looking at map breakdowns back then. But this team can dominate, and I think I said it last week. If you go back to our last video about this, they have the tools to put together a good run into June Joust. And I think even the desk said it this week, uh, before the game that maybe New York could go undefeated into June Joust, but they really just steamrolled the probably arguably second best team in APAC. Like it
Oh,
was nothing.
oh, they fucking rolled them, and I mean, you could. There is a point to make with the Philadelphia Fusion that the roster that they have is the only roster that they can play. There are no, when one of their DPS is going low, they can't sub in Shockwave at the moment. There is a lot of visa issues going on at the moment with the Fusion, and if their team, which is a very momentum-based team, they build up their confidence as they go on with wins. If they can't get those wins on the board, if they can't get those point captures, those checkpoints, then they're not going to be able to come back and mount a comeback. And we saw that only taking the one map and only just taking the one map, only just being able to hold up New York on the last point at the very end of Rialto. So
Right.
if this team can't get it together, if they don't can't put together a run of getting points, getting wins, then they could flip in this division and they could become mid-table. They could go to the bottom, specifically in the June Joust. It's very possible, just depending on how well they can bounce back from this, or if they do at all.
Mhm. I don't think Philly's out yet. I think Philly had a bad weekend, but I think they're too strong and too momentum based, especially coming out of May Melee the way that they did. I think they'll be fine next weekend. I think this was just a rough transition weekend for the Fusion.
Just have to wait and see until they play next. But going into Saturday's games in the NA region, we had another upset. Paris Eternal actually picking up their second win of the season, and in convincing style, beating the Washington Justice, who were the informed team going into this game. They only dropped three maps, as we stressed in the last video. They only dropped three maps coming into this game, and they lost 3-0. And I mean, it was this was one of the longest games that I've ever watched, and it was mainly because of the draws. Paris, when they won in style. I mean, the only point that they really dropped when it wasn't a draw was on Ilios, and they still won 2-1. So I don't know what happened with Paris, but they really turned it around in this game, and they need to use this momentum to then go forward and build off it going into this next main and the rest of the June Draft qualifiers.
I mean, this was um I think something that nobody saw coming because realistically Paris isn't the top NA team. Everybody knows it. Nobody will say it outright, but everybody knows it. The EU teams aren't exactly the most fit to combat the rest of NA because NA is so strong. But this win is a statement win for Paris. This is the definition of a statement win. Only really dropping maps on draws and on Ilios, I assume not even on main Ilios, but just generally taking it to Washington, who arguably is one of the best NA teams by all accounts right now,
Oh yeah,
and just absolutely running the table with them. This is the definition of a statement for Paris.
oh yeah. And granted, there is the argument maybe the Justice they have some of these rookie players, but you can't really say that because their rookie players have come through for them. Like as you see, they only dropped three maps. They picked up 12 maps in the running in May Melee. I don't know what really happened here. They they just couldn't get it together, and Paris were just stronger than them for this weekend. Hopefully, the Justice can turn this around because if you're a Justice fan right now, this really wasn't the best weekend for you, was it?
No.
So, moving on to our next game, we had the Houston Outlaws versus the Atlanta Reign, and the Atlanta Reign won 3-1. Um, this was a really interesting game. You expected the Houston Outlaws to go in this and win. Obviously Atlanta Reign this season, they weren't expected to do like well. They maybe sneak in sixth place or qualifying for some of these tournaments, but this win was big for Atlanta, and they could very well use this weekend and then make a push for the top three, top two spots within NA. I mean, being able to beat a team like Houston is huge, especially with how well they've been doing recently. And I mean, they only dropped three checkpoints this entire series. There's 3-1 them on Hollywood, 3-2 on Junkertown, and 2-0 on Hanamura. I mean, they full held on Hanamura. That's one of the hardest things to do in the game, especially on the attacking side, on the defending side. Sorry.
I mean, I said it already. I'm gonna say it again, and I'm gonna keep saying it. Atlanta is due for a turnaround, and I think this is their turnaround. This weekend proved it that they aren't as bad as people say. This weekend proved that they can stand up with the top NA. And I mean, even the last week of May Melee, we saw it when they played San Francisco. They took them to 5 maps. They battled on map 5. They only lost 3-2. This team is good. They just didn't have it the first 2 weekends. And now they're figuring it out.
And if they can figure out and they can push all the way, they could go all the way in June Joust. Not only getting possibly the semifinals, they could make it to grounds. They could possibly win. It just depends on how well they can keep this form going. And I don't think they have the toughest schedule going forward. I mean, the Houston Outlaws are probably the toughest team that they're going to face in these initial qualifiers. Obviously, they're going to face the top of NA when they actually have to qualify for the tournament itself. But in these league games, they're picking up wins where it matters, and they're proving that they can beat these top teams. So,
They're a force to be reckoned with right now, in my opinion.
oh yeah. Moving into the next game, we have the Toronto Defiant who faced the Boston Uprising, and I'll be honest, we did shit on the Boston Uprising in the initial predictions video, but to be fair, they hadn't really shown what they were capable of and what they were about in the main menu. They really give a good account for themselves, and I think they took that time off, they regrouped, and they came back in a big way. They got two big wins this weekend. We'll obviously go over the second one later, but for starting off, 3-0ing the Toronto Defiant. I mean, obviously, as we've said, Toronto they're fighting for those last qualification spots in each and every tournament. But for a team who were anticipated to be one of the bottom feeders of NA along with the European teams, they showed that they're not going to be that bottom seed team. They're not going to be that bottom feeder team. They're going to try and compete and sneak into these last seed spots, or maybe even make a push for the higher seeds.
Right, and I think that's something that we're gonna keep seeing, especially with a big weekend, as you just mentioned for Boston. But even then, I mean, just taking it to a top NA West team who now sit at 4-2, but really taking it to Toronto and even looking at the map breakdown, I mean, it was pretty close every map except maybe Ilios, but still being able to come out, take Toronto in 3 maps like that is huge.
Oh yeah. And they just need to keep this going and keep going with these big results. I mean, obviously, it's a big ask to say, okay, you've got to come out every week and you've got to get these 3-0s, because I don't think that's going to happen for Boston each and every week. Yes, this was a very good week for them. They've 3-0 two of the bigger teams, but I don't think they're. I, see, I was going to say I don't think they can do it, but maybe they can. But I feel they will drop some maps here and there, and that they're not going to have clean 3-0s every single week. But they could still pick up their wins here and there, and like I said, get into the top 6 very easily if they keep up this run of form.
Right, and I don't even I think they really don't have to come out and get 3-0s every week. They just need to come out, be scrappy, fix their map differential, and just get wins.
Yeah. So moving into, I mean, I don't know. I mean, you could call this an upset in some respects, but the Honshu Spark are not a bad team on paper. So maybe you can label this as a match that could have really gone either way. But looking at their records, you would have expected Shanghai to take this win because they are the dominating team in APAC at the moment. But Honshu Spark actually picking up the 3-0 win.
Yeah, I feel like this is surprising, yes, but I also feel like it's not surprising. I mean, like you just said, the Sparks roster is very good, and I mean, even commentators and the desk have said it multiple times that while yes, realistically, the Spark are one of the bottom feeders in APAC. They're still 3-3. They still have a +3 map differential. They've still only lost 10 maps. That's better than a lot of these other APAC teams, and it's pretty close. It's pretty close to the top of APAC, where Philly has dropped 9 maps, Shanghai's dropped 8, Chengdu's dropped 8. The only one who hasn't dropped close to 10 maps is Seoul, and Seoul's in fourth in APAC.
Yeah, and I mean, it's so easy for them, for Hangzhou at this point, to sneak into that top four and get qualification, especially with how up and down Seoul Dynasty have been recently. Like, they can make put a run together in this June Joust qualifiers and make the actual tournament itself. It's just dependent on how well they can come out each and every week and how well I mean I'm gonna say specifically Seoul Dynasty because I think those top three spots are pretty much gonna be secure throughout this entire qualification period. But fighting for that fourth spot, they could definitely get it by the end of it.
Yeah, I mean, they could even sneak into that top 3 if, we see Philly continue to struggle through the entirety of the qualifiers for June Joust, but realistically, they could sneak into that Seoul spot, especially with Seoul playing this weekend, and if we see how well Seoul plays this weekend.
Oh yeah, it's very much dependent on what Seoul Dynasty we get this weekend. They didn't really make a good account for themselves. They have 3-3 at the moment. I mean, they've only really dropped 3 maps, but like they're still it's yeah, it's not the best. It's not really the best Seoul Dynasty we've seen, especially for a team that made grand finals last year. So moving over, we have the next game, which was newest Excelsior playing the Guangzhou Charge, and for a team that for 3-1 to the Fusion the previous day, uh, what I don't know what happened. But the charge came out and they said, "Listen, we're not going to be going down as this bottom feeder team. And we're going to try and take this." And yeah, again, it was scrappy. That's how the charge play. That's basically their MO at this point. They pretty much lost. They lost a point on every single map, but they full held the Excelsior in their final map on the fourth map of Hanamura, which again is very impressive to do. Um, and some impressive wins on specifically Hollywood, completing the map, which is something that we've said previously. Not every single team is capable of doing. So they made a good account of themselves in this second game for the weekend.
Yeah, they I think thinking about it realistically, I think for the Charge, this was more of a flash in the pan win than anything else. And I hate to say it like that because I do think Guangzhou can make a push at some point, but I also feel like they're in a stage of either rebuilding or just not being as good as the rest of APAC at the moment. So possibly this was just a drop by the Excelsior after coming off the high of beating the second best team in APAC, where they came in and said, "We don't really have to try to beat the Charge," and then the Charge kind of just threw that out the window.
Yeah, I mean, as we've been saying, it's just gonna be what they can do going forward in future weeks. Because yeah, granted, you can get these big wins on week one, but you need to be able to use that and then put together future wins. That they can't realistically, if they want to make pushes, they can't let this be a flash in the pan, and they have to keep using that momentum, saying, okay, maybe they weren't expecting us to win, but we can still come out and get those wins because not every single team might be expecting the same thing. And granted, it will get to a point where teams are saying, okay, maybe this team is more competent than we're expecting them to be. But at the moment, they can use this little, I won't call it a gimmick, but it's essentially to say, okay, these higher teams aren't really expecting us to come out, and maybe they're gonna roll us over, but we're gonna take it to them, and we're gonna show them that we're gonna fight, and we're gonna try our best to win. And if they can keep doing that, then maybe they can make a push. But as you said, I don't think it's going to happen in the June Joust. Maybe going into Summer Showdown, they can try and make a push for top four, maybe fifth. But at the moment, it's very much looking like it might be a flash in the pan for the Charge.
Yeah.
So moving over, we now have the other game we hyped up. The Philadelphia Fusion kind of let us down this weekend. I'm not gonna lie, but
A little bit.
3-1 to the Chengdu Hunters, and this was even though Philadelphia Fusion got that map, the only reason they got that map was because there were errors in on the map where they were playing on Dorado, where the Hunters were just about to push it over the line, and they had a disconnect. They had to pause, and by the time they unpaused it, the Hunters had lost all of their momentum, and then the Fusion just managed to full hold them for that last point and pick up that map. Otherwise, this was a very dominant win for the Chengdu Hunters.
Yeah. I mean, I'd love to say it's close because we got that draw on map 4 of Anubis, but 2-0ing on Busan, 2-1 on Eichenwald, so neither team made it past basically that first point, and then 2-0 on Ilios. I mean, there really is no other word than domination from Chengdu for this week. And people were even saying after they won Dorado, maybe we see a reverse sweep and then just a draw and a pretty hefty loss on Ilios. Kind of have been killing the Fusion's momentum this weekend.
Yeah, and I mean, again, with not them not being able to switch out when maybe their players aren't really performing the best, whereas the Chengdu Hunters do have that luxury. They have that flexible DPS line, they have that flexible tank and support line. They have like one of the biggest rosters. They can just switch out if one of their players is not performing as well as they want to, or maybe they feel like a different player is suited for a different map. They can just make out and adapt on the fly, whereas the Fusion just have to say, okay, this is the team we got. We got to keep going and hoping that we can pick up a map win somewhere.
I think that's gonna, and maybe I'll talk about this maybe a little more, unless this is the last time we're seeing Philly this weekend. But that those visa troubles and the inability to be flexible on the fly with your DPS line or your support line or even your tank line, I think is going to come back and bite Philly for just about every week until they fix these visa troubles and get their backups in.
Yeah. So we could see, like I said, if and when they can get their visas sorted, they could make a turnaround. But it's not looking like. I mean, the earliest visas I've seen coming in for these other teams is the 10th of June, which is the knockouts for the actual tournament itself. So unless they can somehow build momentum going into their next games, they could struggle to qualify, especially if we see the spark continue this form they're in, or maybe Seoul Dynasty pick up their form when they play this coming week. It's really dependent on if they can rally the team morale and come back in a big way when they play next.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to be moving on to the final NA games this weekend. We have the Atlanta Reign against the London Spitfire, and this was a game that a lot of people were looking at as this could be London's first win, and it just wasn't. This was a dominating win for Atlanta Reign, and very much you could mark this as a statement win for the rest of their season. Even though London, yes, they're one of the bottom feeders of NA at the moment, they they went out and they fucking dominated this team, and they really showed that this is a team that is capable of doing something. Like you've been saying, they can make a push and they are a good team. I mean, the only point London got, well, they got 3 points this entire series. They got 3-2 on Eichenwald and 3-1 on Dorado or Rialto, sorry, no Dorado. Um, Otherwise, it was a 2-0 in Lijiang Tower. The only really map we contested on was Eichenwald, and it's very much, I've said it to you before, but it's very much the support line of the Spitfire that's just been capitulating. And they were saying it the casters were saying it. Their their DPS line knew that they had to target the London's support line and take them out. And as soon as they did that, London just fell apart because you had this really dive centric team, classic dive being played by London, and they did not switch it until the final map, where yes, they took the first point, and that was because they switched their composition up. But playing Diva and Winston really wasn't working for them, especially when you're trying to push points on map like Iconwall, because you can't keep the pressure on the point and give the space for your DPS to properly play the game.
Mm. I mean, like you just said, this is another. big statement win for Atlanta. I mean, we broke it down a little bit last week or prior to this match, and I don't think we gave I think we maybe gave London a little bit too much credit. Uh, but credit where credit's due, they did have a good Eichenwald. But other than that, I mean, this Atlanta Reign team, I think I even said it after watching the stream. They're putting the pieces together.
Oh,
They they have something going on right now that I think more NA teams should start to be scared of what Atlanta can come in and do.
yeah, it's a very good encounter they gave themselves this weekend, and I very much think they're going to be able to use this momentum and very much qualify, and not even sixth spot. I think they could make a top push for the top three, maybe fourth if they're unlucky with some of their games, but I think they'll definitely be in and around that region going into the actual qualifiers for the June Joust next weekend. So we're going to move on, and we had Boston Uprising against the Washington Justice. Like I said, not the really the best weekend for you if you're a Washington fan. But a very good weekend if you're a Boston fan. This was just fantastic from the Boston Uprising. They full held on Junkertown. They 2-0'd them on Lijiang Tower. The only point that Washington got was on Hollywood. I mean, granted, neither team finished these maps, but still, they full held them after getting the hybrid point, which was really impressive, especially because, like I said, it's hard to finish this map when you're the attacking team, and yeah, just a dominating win from the Boston Uprising.
Yeah, and I think uh, I'm going into the rosters right now, but I think really the Boston's DPS line, which hadn't showed us much going into the May Melee, especially from Valentine and I'm 37, who are arguably two of the better DPS in the league right now. Uh, they're starting to really stand out and show us we can play. We aren't a bottom feeder. The May Melee was just a fluke. We have what it takes, and even some of the rookies like Punk, their tank and just the rest of their tank line with fusions and stand one. This Boston team on paper is really, really good. And I think May Melee and especially this weekend showed that May Melee was just a fluke where they weren't prepared and they didn't have the team chemistry yet, but now they're figuring it out.
Yeah, and I don't think like yes, they had a very good win this weekend, both very good wins. Maybe they may not be able to keep up against some of the other teams that they're going to come up against later on in the qualifiers, but this form could take them into outside spot. Like they could have a Dallas Fuel run. In terms of being the outside team and qualifying in sixth place. Maybe not winning it, but just qualifying in sixth place and maybe making it to the tournament. But I think it'll just be a win for them, even if they can make it into the actual like regional knockouts for the June Joust.
Oh, absolutely.
So final game of the weekend now. We had the Houston Outlaws versus the Florida Mayhem, and start of this map very much looked like Florida were gonna dominate this game, but Houston pulled it together and they really showed that yes, we are the top one of the top teams in NA. We are actually the top team in NA as of the final as of this weekend. And oh my god, this Houston team is amazing. I'm just gonna say it. They full held on Eichenwald. Yes, Dorado was a bit of a weaker map for them, but they still got full held them in the second round in terms of like getting the 3 points then going on and got the first checkpoint and won. And they full held them on the Temple of Anubis. They really showed that yes, Florida took the first map in dominating style, but listen, we're not gonna go down without a fight and we're gonna take it and basically got the win pretty much almost instantly in terms of these maps. Like, apart from Dorado, it's a dominating display from them, and it's very much down to that. I mean, their entire team is fantastic, but their tank line and their DPS line specifically are just some of the best in the league. Especially, I think top three contenders in the league easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the first game of the weekend for Houston was sort of a an outlier because maybe they weren't ready. They had just come off Melee, but then just again domination from Houston. Exactly what everybody was expecting from Houston against Florida because they had the rough I believe they lost to Florida in May Melee. If I'm not remembering correctly, then that's my fault. Don't exactly quote me on it. But I believe they lost to Florida in May Melee, so maybe they had some vengeance coming into this Florida game too.
Oh yeah, they could. It was Florida seemed to be this team that seemed to take that team stack to take their angle on. I mean, you saw it with the Sharks in the May May qualifiers. They came out after losing to Houston and dominated them. And then, if that is the case that they did lose to Florida in the qualifiers to the May May, they came out and said, "Oh well, we're gonna actually dominate you this time around, and you're gonna just have to deal with it." And I think I mean, we haven't really spoken much on the hero pool. I mean, the casters kind of took it to the extreme, but um, I think having Dante on that Echo rather than any other player, maybe playing Tracer or playing any other hero, I think that really helped, and he really showed what he was capable of doing on Echo and their entire team. I mean, yeah, you didn't really have Django as much this weekend, obviously because of the Ryan ban, and maybe he's not as confident on other characters yet, but their sub-ins were just fantastic in that tank line, and Piggy really held his own as their mainstay tank for this weekend.
Yeah, I I don't see honestly. I mean, I'm sure we'll talk about it um a little more once we start doing our actual predictions later. But I don't see them dropping another game
I
the for the rest of June Joust. I really can't say that they will.
they're going to be fighting up there with Dallas, with San Francisco possibly if they can turn it around, and with Florida for the top teams. It's going to be a very interesting battle for the top seed in June It's very much more than it was going into May Mela, because looking at May Mela, you were looking at that fifth and sixth seed who's going to sneak in and get the last seed. I think this is going to be much more a battle for, okay, who's going to get the top seed and who's going to possibly get the easier matchups going into these qualifiers in terms of positional standings. That's what you, yeah. So those were all of the games that happened this weekend. We're just going to quickly go into the power rankings this weekend. Obviously there hasn't been really much changes. Some of the Dragons players have moved up. But it's still the Dallas Fuel dominating at the top of the power rankings, pretty much basically in every single category, and I think it's mainly because this weekend was very much the upset weekend. Some of these teams didn't really have their players in the top of the power rankings, so the movements didn't really matter as much, with depth room for Dallas to stay on top. But still, you have in the sports specifically, Jackson moved down to third, and you had Izayaki moving in. I think that's well deserved if Izayaki, especially adapting on the fly and playing that honor. Like I believe we said he was going into on our predictions last week. We said, well, if he can't play Zen, then it's going to be the honor that he's going to switch over to, and that they basically give more utility. And he was very useful on that on the honor throughout the weekend.
Yeah, and I think we're gonna keep seeing Izyaki's Ana and possibly even just Izyaki's Ana even after Zen comes back during Summer Showdown, because I think, like I said, Ana gives more of an oomph to a support line because you have more that you can do with Ana than Zen, where it's basically just throwing out Discord orbs and trying to get kills. You can actually do a lot more healing with Ana. You can block the other team from healing, and you can put the tanks to sleep, which is a big advantage for your team.
Oh yeah, those sleep darts are very big for changing the tides of team fights. Because once you know that that person's asleep, you can just target down as a team and eliminate one of their biggest threats potentially. And it's just the utility that's the utility Honor offers. Um, So some of the drops this weekend are very much focused around the Philadelphia Fusion. Um, yeah, they haven't really had. I mean, Alarm is in that top 10 region. I think he was very much the standout player this weekend for the Fusion. Very consistent on the honor and basically every role that he played, but it wasn't enough to keep the Fusion alive. You got Slime moving up a bit. Um, the Chengdu Hunters support line has actually dropped considerably, which is surprising because Monk and Nisha made a very good showing for themselves this weekend. The desk and the casters were picking up on that a lot. How they were actually shocked that Nisha was subbed out going into that Dragons game. his Mercy has just been a standout for the Chunky Hunters so far.
Yeah, and maybe that's just because of people like Izzyaki, and I think even possibly Crimzo moved up again, this week in the power rankings because Crimzo showed out again for the Houston Outlaws, which he has consistently showed out.
Yeah,
But it's also possibly just because the Mercy meta is starting to fade with Ana coming into the mix and, BAP still being a big part of the meta right now.
yeah. We're just to wait and see then. Yeah, pretty much across the board. I mean, Jockey has fallen down a bit, and mainly because Florida didn't really have the best weekend outside of their win over London. Again, there's no discredit Jockey. He's still one of the best players in the league on damage, clearly as he's ranked fourth, but still, he's dropped down. Lip's actually taken his place, and I think that's well deserved. Lip's done really well on that long range hit scan. Um, they're really doing the work for the Dragons this weekend.
I mean, yeah, just in general, looking at every power ranking, I mean, it seems like just about every Dragons player has moved up into that top 10 of the power rankings. And I really don't see them falling out of the top 10 of their respective roles for a long time because this Shanghai team looks dominant, and it's proof just in their players being ranked so highly right now.
Oh yeah. I mean, talking about their tank as well, Fate and Void, they were so good in their games this weekend. Fate specifically was fucking monstrous on, especially Wrecking Ball, which is obviously is a character that's mostly picked for stalling tactics, but he has actually a really good main tank on Wrecking Ball this weekend, and showed that maybe this Ryan ban hasn't affected the Dragons as much as anybody was expecting to. So yeah, um, those were the power rankings, and we're gonna wrap up this video. There will be another video coming out later on this week where we're gonna go over our predictions. We're gonna go over the coming week teams. So yeah, look out for that one. And I hope you enjoyed this video, and thank you for the support on the previous video. So if you enjoyed this video, hit that like button as usual. Subscribe if you're new, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.